What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up.
From my standpoint, it's very easy to separate step 8 and 9, because 8 is a roadmap. 8 is a list. 8 is getting really clear and preparing for step 9. It doesn't involve actually doing any work with anybody else other than perhaps your sponsor or your therapist or your step guide, somebody. And it really is, I'm not sure, I have not read the chapter on self-assertiveness, but my initial inclination is that it's in the context of self-esteem, and I see that as appropriate. And it's the beginning of building self-esteem by doing esteemable acts, because in the sense of self-assertiveness, you're taking responsibility for the harm you've done to other people. The one thing that I could never have done was come to a decision about what's appropriate and inappropriate on my own. No, because I'm a recalcitrant narcissist. And it would be very difficult for me to have an objectivity. And so my sounding board in the step guide part, probably about 30% of the time, he gave me feedback that was completely contrary to my evaluation of what was the appropriate, what was even healthy. He just challenged me, never told me what to do, but he always challenged me, holding that mirror up for me to evaluate or reevaluate who I would make amends to, and even if in fact I had made harm. At one point he said to me, "Herb, you're just not that important or powerful. So you're way overestimating your impact on other people," which was, of course, the total point of the 8th and 9th step, which is actually, in contrast to therapy in one sense, or self-esteem in another sense, the total point of step 8 is the deflation of the ego at death, not the support of the unhealthy ego, but the renovation of it so that it's a healthy ego. And I've just read over the chapter on step 4 in the 12 and 12, and he talked about right relationships through partnership. Part of this process of steps 8 and 9, as I experienced it, was the acknowledgement of the negative impact of my life on other people. It was startlingly and horrifying news for me to actually see it and accept it. I now know that was the beginning of healthy self-esteem, in the sense that I was getting a accurate appraisal of who I am not, and how all of that impacted the behavior with other people. And part of the process of the 8th step is the preparation for acknowledgement to the other person. That was so important to my wife, because I had gaslighted her so badly that she didn't know what she thought or what she felt and what was right or what was wrong for so many years, because I'm a convincing salesperson at the same time, an overbearing narcissist. And so part of the acknowledging sort of the underbelly of the behavior and the motives and the stuff that was going on with us was so healing for her, because she finally got a sense of, oh, I'm not crazy. You're the one that's crazy. So that was just the acknowledgement of the difficulty. Um, the key I want to emphasize from my experience in the 8th and the 9th step is the preparation through sponsorship and guidance. And sometimes I needed a therapist to guide me. At one point, I needed an attorney to guide me, but I could not determine the full implications of what did it include to make amends. Certainly for me to change my behavior, yes, but also then to attempt to acknowledge it in the sense of the apology, but also in the sense of attempting to repair it. And I learned a word in the process of healing from the experience, and I learned a lot more about the word forgiveness after I had done the process and began to study the whole dynamic of forgiveness, which actually began in the 4th step and concluded with the conclusion of the 9th step. So it's one of the more robust areas, 8 and 9, and probably the most sacred, because you're dealing with other people and correcting or repairing, I'll say repairing, not correcting necessarily, but repairing the damage from the conscious and unconscious impact of my negative self-serving behavior. So I got more, but there's always more. Thank you. Thanks, Declan, very much.
Thank you, Herb. Yeah, there's always so much food for thought. Things very much worth chewing on, Herb, after you share. Declan, I'm so happy that you had an opportunity to share what you had written. You had done. You're welcome. You've done a lot of preparation, obviously, for your discussant role 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And gave it a lot of thought. Man, I'm very impressed, both with the how of your presentation as well as the what, as well as the content. So I'm especially appreciative that you brought the pillar of self-assertiveness into our discussion of step 8, because we haven't talked much about that pillar of self-esteem up to now. And it's, as Brandon says, one of the 6 pillars, or if we include willingness, one of the 7 pillars. And it makes sense we haven't talked about it that much, because step 8 is the first one that is explicitly focused on other people, right? I mean, we can talk about self-assertiveness in terms of different parts of ourselves with one another, expressing themselves and answering and that kind of stuff. But self-assertiveness, I know, was very central to Nathaniel Brandon's way of being in the world, as well as his way of conceptualizing self-esteem. The way that Alan talks about it a lot is learning how to, first of all, have the kind of self-awareness and self-connection that we need to have a sense of who we are, what we think, what we want, and then all the obstacles that we experience growing up, and most of us have a lot of them, about feeling free to express what we think, what we feel. And these are all acts of self-assertiveness. Taking action, Herb, you referenced that, to express ourselves, moving toward what we want, moving away or saying no to what we don't want or don't like. Then you add the whole other piece of turning it. I talked last week about I, you, and we, and how for me, at any given moment, I tend to reside in one of those 3 places in my relationship consciousness. And far more often than I used to think, I'm located firmly in I, rather than in you or in we. And I could relate to her when you talk about the horror when you began to get glimpses of the word I love to use is just how oblivious, amazingly oblivious I have been, at times will continue to be, certainly still. But, I had invested in this idea that I was a reasonably empathetic, reasonably sensitive, reasonably caring person. Well, actually, let me share a story, and it's compared to, the amends in step 8, where the level of harm has just been horrific, horrendous, done to other people. I really heard what you said, that your sponsor said to you, though. Herb, you're overestimating your importance here. See, that's why this idea of balance is so important to me, and I keep going back to it over and over again. Alan talks about it as falling out of one side of the bed or the other. We've still fallen on the floor and landed hard. Okay, so, but that's another place this can go if that's my tendency. If that's my tendency, I can go way too far in the direction of excessive emotional dependency. I can go way too far in the direction of being completely closed off to other people and feel like I want no connection to other people whatsoever. So that's where self-awareness comes in. How do I function? What are my patterns? Those are not easy to see for me or for any of us. But let me share this story. And it's important to me in terms of harm I was doing, not because the level of harm was anywhere near what we're talking about with a list in step 8, but it involved my son. So at an emotional level, it carries a lot of emotional weight for me. When my son was, I think, 5, in preschool, they had a career day, right? Where some of the kids had their moms and dads come in and talk about what kind of work they did in their lives and try to explain it in terms that, 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds could understand. And there were several parents who came in and wanted to share. So I didn't do that particular process in the classroom. But we went out to the car. We had the carpool lane in the car seat, and the preschool teachers helped my son get into the car seat and strapped him in. And we're starting to drive away. And he said, "Daddy, what do you do? What kind of work do you do?" Because I can't remember, honestly. He was 5, he's 26 now. It was a day or two ago. Okay. But I told him, "Well, son, I work as a counselor, and I sit with people who might be sad or mad or scared or unhappy with something they've done. And I try to help them, understand what they're feeling, and I try to help them feel better. I try to help them figure out how to, make things better for themselves and for other people." And I'm called the counselor, and those people are called my clients. And I could see him in the rearview mirror, right? So I saw his little 5-year-old eyes go up for a few minutes. And he said, "Daddy, sometimes I think you should be the client and not the counselor."
Whoa.
Out of the mouths of babes. I looked at him and I said, "What do you mean, hon?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, sometimes you get mad at mommy and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry." And I'm stunned.
Wow.
Because my pattern is my ex-wife, notice the preface, we were not arguers, we were not fighters, we didn't, argue loudly with one another, almost never. Neither she nor I are particularly confrontational. So our problem is usually not addressing things sufficiently and not getting angry sometimes when we probably should have. But the reason I'm bringing this up is he could tell when I was angry sometimes. He could probably tell when his mom was angry with me sometimes. And he didn't like it. It scared him.
Mm.
It worried him. And I thought I was very engaged in my son's life, still am, probably overly engaged. And I didn't have a clue. I did not have a clue that he had that perception, that he had that thought. So I made an amends to him. I said, oh my gosh, son, I'm so happy that you're telling me this. I had no idea. And I talked with him about, it's okay if his mom and I are behaving in some way that he's worried, that I'd really like it if he could talk to me about that. And I asked him if he thought he could do that. And he thought he probably could. And I tell you, he learned quickly. Okay. Once he got permission, he started letting me know exactly what he thought about all kinds of things, right? In terms of my behavior toward his mom, particularly, sometimes toward him. But that was a real wake-up call in terms of my own consciousness. And it was incredibly important to me that he shared that with me. And again, I don't mean to draw any kind of equivalence between being out of touch with when my son was scared or worried or troubled about my behavior. But because that was so personally meaningful to me, I wanted to share it. Just as an example, and of course I could give thousands upon thousands of examples of when I have, in retrospect, been able to see just how amazingly self-centered and self-preoccupied I have been. So thank you again, Declan. Outstanding content, man. And I could go on about appropriate and inappropriate because, Bill starts off step 9, talking about the degree of reflection that's needed, before making a decision to make amends to somebody, and the thoughtfulness that needs to go into that. So that's all I have for now. Tom, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thank you, Declan. Great job, and Roger and Herb, as always. Appreciate the input. I really keyed off a few ideas here that that Declan introduced, which was the word appropriate, which for an alcoholic addict, like I could bend that rule quite a bit. And like, as Herb said, I need guidance. I need both a in-person guide, as well as some spiritual help to manage that level of what's appropriate. There's a section in the 12 and 12 where it talks about forgiving others, forgiving the wrongs done us, real or fancied, right? And that reminds me of when I was a teenager. I was trying to find my way a little bit, and I picked up on some astrology book, and I'm a Scorpio, and one of the traits of a Scorpio, it says, imagines slights where there are none, which means has resentments for things that didn't happen. And I was like, oh, that like later on when I did step work therapy, I'm like, oh yeah, like there's all kinds of stuff I've made up in my head about harms that other people have done which weren't true, and things that I had done to others which I had written off as, oh, it was no big deal, and that I think that as time has gone on, as I've gotten to a degree of humility and honesty with myself and a degree of emotional sobriety, I've been better with that discernment of what's appropriate or not, and where I've, stepped over the line. What I do know is making amends in recovery after a bit of time is almost more painful, and painful is not the right word, uncomfortable, in terms of like, oh, like I should know better by now. Like, it's like, this wasn't a, hey, I was drunk and I, I needed drugs and I stole from you or anything. That this was like, oh, this is seated in some insecurity, some selfishness, and I acted out in that way. So in long-term sobriety, 8 and 9 is because I either was too slow on my 10th step, making amends promptly, and I let something simmer or slide back in my awareness, and it keeps gnawing away at me that I need to make it at some point, and it winds up on a list and I need to do an 8 and 9. Or I didn't have the clarity, right? I didn't, at the time I didn't think it was an amendable act, and eventually it becomes clear, again through some 8 and 9 process or talking it through, and it winds up on a list. What I found is that my step 10, that word promptly has really become important, just to kind of bounce to making amends on a more, immediate basis. Promptly early on meant like, if I make it within a couple months, it's fine. But that uncomfortability of sitting with that for so long, and, Declan used the word stuck, my anxiety manifests itself in being stuck. It's the indecision, it's the not, either afraid to act on an instinct or what I think is right, for, out of fear, or some other way that just, holds me back. And so, it was good to kind of pull that all together. But I think that we, finally, just before we open up the sharing to the rest of the group, what the amends process has done, at least in step 8, is, it's added refinement to my recovery, right? Again, just like I said before about how, it's no longer because I was drunk or high back then. It's these, these more subtle harms, right? It's the more subtle impact. You used the word impact, I think, Herb, a couple weeks ago when you talked. It's like, how am I affecting those around me? And it's and it leads to self-esteem, back to kind of the major overarching topic that we've been doing here, because I start to clean up my side of the street so much quicker, so much more, cleaner, taking care of the more subtler defects and the subtler harms. It frees me up to have more, energy to care for myself more in my self-esteem and my approach to life, because I'm not so worried about, what's hanging out there unsaid, unaddressed.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved, the forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. The first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. We're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.